Further questions on this item number 2? Further questions? All right. I've received no blue card on this. Mr. Becerra is outside. Would somebody go grab him? He's standing right there in the door. Mr. Becerra, from your note, did you wish to talk on item 2 on the agenda or water policy 2? You want to talk about decreased reliance, or you want to talk about the certification process?
I apologize. I may have written it wrong. I wanted to talk on the transfer issue and the sunset.
It's over.
And the sunset in particular.
Well, it's over.
Because the sunset issue came up after public comment, and it has a very significant impact potentially.
Members, what do you want to do? I mean, we'll be here. We're going to be here 100 hours if everybody gets to go back. What do you want to do?
Well, and I put my comment card in during that period. I apologize if it wasn't specific enough. I was at the podium.
The card says for item number 2.
And I'll be happy to write down a better item number. But the main point is, if your deadline falls in the middle of a critically dry year, you will have every water transfer in the state sitting in front of you at the time that you are considering what to do about this exemption, and not just the pre-14s, all of the post-14s as well, which is potentially hundreds of thousands of acre feet sitting in front of you at the time of your sunset.
Mr. Fiorini.
Brian, that's why we assigned a date certain for the council to review that based on advice from the work group, but we're not limited to waiting for them. We will review it in September prior to the December 31st deadline.
But at this point, that exemption for all water transfers sunsets.
It's not. It only covers temporary transfers.
But all 1-year transfers, the exemption sunsets as of now, correct?
Yeah, I understand this issue was vetted. I questioned it. We reached an agreement, I guess you'd call it a compromise, that the council will review this. And our intent is for it not to just simply go away, but to address it and to modify it or to reaffirm it. So your concern was discussed, and we reached a decision based on 6 council members' input.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, back to item number 2. Is there anyone in the audience who wanted to talk about item number 2, certification process, all that? Okay, in that, I guess the motion would be to accept the staff proposed changes. Okay, is there a motion? Mr. Johnston, second? Second. Mr. Fiorini, discussion? Okay, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Gray, aye. Marcus, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye. Foley, aye. Okay, 6-0. Okay, members and audience, if you would flip over the matrix to item number 3. This is an issue raised by by staff and the Ag-Urban Coalition about the use of the phrase proposed action versus covered actions and the implications. So, Mr. Ray, if you would take this one, please.
Yeah, in drafting the second chapter's description about how consistency certifications would be made in the process for doing that, we introduced the new term of proposed action. A proposed action is an activity that meets the 4 basic screening criteria. It's within or wholly or partially within the delta. It's a project under secret, meets the other screening criteria. And then there's a final question. Is it covered by the plan? And that's what makes it a covered action. And so we introduced that term. It created some confusion among folks who were reviewing the plan because it hadn't been seen before, and so we're trying to clarify how a proposed action differs from a covered action. This is the language we propose to do that.
Okay. Mr. Stevens, since this is a legal issue, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, good. Okay.
Proposed action was an attempt by staff to try to clarify the process and help stakeholders. We had heard a lot of concerns that the definition of covered action that we repeatedly pointed to was complex, so it was difficult for stakeholders to figure out whether or not their proposed projects were actually covered actions. And as you recall, there are several criteria. We tried to group them together and give them a catchy name, and we came up with screening criteria. Dan referred to those as well. The one that Dan referred to amongst the screening criteria that you get to after you've determined that you're in the Delta, there's a public agency nexus, it's going to have a significant impact on the co-equal goals, is whether or not there's a provision in the Delta plan, which we've determined are the regulatory policies, whether or not there's actually a regulatory policy that covers you and turns the proposed project into a covered action. So stakeholders said, we read your policies, but not only are they interesting and somewhat complex in certain cases, but we'd like you to tell us in those policies what they're covering. So when we come and we have our checklist and we're going through the screening criteria trying to figure out if we have a covered action, then we turn to the Delta plan and we look at the policies. We want to see in those policies language that says this policy actually covers these types of projects, so we can tell easily in one place whether or not we have covered actions or not. So this was an attempt to actually make things easier in terms of the analysis, because the analysis is admittedly complex. The issue that had been raised in the last set of stakeholder comments and talking to a few of the people that sent in the letters was really heightened with regard to water resources policy number 1. And we'll talk about that next. But the opening language of that had changed from referring to a covered action. In that case, a covered action is inconsistent with the Delta plan or consistent with the Delta plan. And we had changed to a proposed action. And that had sent off or rung the alarm bells of some of the water users that thought, hey, wait a second, you're enlarging now perhaps the universe of actions that you think you have jurisdiction over, which was never the case. So we went back and we made a modification to the language in WPR1. But at the same time, what we took from the stakeholder comments was that we had to be more clear in the body of each of the policies that for purposes of that particular screening criteria, the triggering effect, whether or not a policy actually covers a proposed project, had to be in bold. And so we've gone back to each, we're recommending that we go back to each of the policies and make it clear what the policies are covering for purposes of that screening criteria. Similarly, we're proposing that we come up with a text box in the Chapter 2, which talks about proposed actions, screening criteria, and differentiates between what a covered action is and what a proposed action is. And again, just for the record, the regulatory effect of the policies comes into play with covered actions. Okay, so the policies have regulatory binding effect on covered actions. But the issue here is trying to help stakeholders figure out, not stakeholders, but state and local agencies that have proposed projects, whether or not those proposed projects actually meet the definition of covered actions. So it was an attempt to try to make this process a little more straightforward. So
Okay,
to clear up, again, a text box,
Got it.
explanation, and a few language changes.
Okay, questions of Mr. Stevens or Mr. Ray on this point? I just raised one thing, and it just caught my attention. On the staff proposed new language on item 3, I understand the first sentence. Is the second sentence necessary? I mean, I looked at it and I said, we ought to say it meets the first 4 screening criteria, and then just go, if the proposed action is not covered by any policy, it's not a covered action. There's something, I think it's grammatically odd to me as much as anything about the second sentence. Just think about that for a minute.
Are you referring to the
If the
comma,
proposed
but-
action is covered by at least one policy, then the proposed action is a covered action. Well, I mean, it might or might not be. It has to meet all 4 tests.
Right.
It just, grammatically, it doesn't.
Well,
I
it's
think
not a
that the-
proposed action
right.
unless it does meet the first 4 tests.
So again,
By definition.
that's what we were trying to do. So
Okay,
the issue
all right.
was stakeholders and others were saying, when we focus in on your policies, we want to make sure that you're not trying to focus in on proposed projects that haven't already been screened for being in the delta in whole or in part or having a significant impact. And we've always said, when it comes to the policies, we're talking about big projects that are going to have significant impacts that are in the delta in whole or in part. The idea of introducing the term of proposed action, as Joe alludes to, that encompasses the fact that you've already determined that you've met all of the screening criteria except for identifying that there's a policy that covers you and turns you into a covered action. So I can tell by the silence and the glazed looks that this is helping to clarify the issue. But Joe is absolutely correct. Using the term a proposed action, as we define it, means you've already met all the screening criteria.
No,
except for the
I
trigger.
just got that far. Okay.